The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential compound in Ouagadougou as Ibrahim Traore adjusted his military uniform one final time. At just 34 years old, he had become one of Africa's youngest leaders through a military coup that shocked the world. But today would test everything he stood for. The meeting had been arranged by General Kwame Asante from Ghana, a veteran military leader with over 3 decades of experience. Asante had served under multiple governments and survived numerous political changes across West Africa. His weathered face told stories of countless battles, both on the battlefield and in the corridors of power. He commanded respect from military leaders across the continent. Joining Asante were 4 other prominent African generals. General Mohammed Bashir from Nigeria, known for his iron fist approach to dealing with insurgencies in the north. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. Soldiers under his command spoke of him with mixture of fear and admiration. He had crushed several rebellions and maintained order in some of Nigeria's most volatile regions. General Patricia Mwangi from Kenya represented the East African military establishment. She had broken barriers as one of the few female generals on the continent and commanded the respect of her male counterparts. Her strategic mind had helped resolve border disputes and peacekeeping missions across the region. Many considered her the most politically astute among the group. General Abdul Rahman from Egypt brought decades of experience from North Africa's complex political landscape. He had witnessed the rise and fall of multiple governments and understood the delicate balance between military power and civilian rule. His connections stretched from Cairo to Addis Ababa. Finally, General Sifo Ndaba from South Africa represented the southern region. His involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle had given him legendary status, but his recent years had been marked by controversial decisions that divided public opinion. He believed in strong leadership above all else. These 5 generals had flown into Burkina Faso's capital with a clear mission. They represented a coalition of African military leaders who were deeply concerned about Traore's radical policies and his growing influence among young Africans across the continent. His anti-French rhetoric and calls for African unity were creating ripple effects that threatened established power structures. The international conference room in the presidential palace had been prepared for what many expected would be a routine diplomatic meeting. Crystal glasses filled with water sat on the polished mahogany table. The flags of various African nations hung from golden poles around the room. Everything appeared normal, but tension filled the air like electricity before a storm. Traore had risen to power through a coup in September 2022, overthrowing the transitional government led by Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. His rise wasn't accidental or opportunistic. It came after years of frustration with foreign interference in Burkina Faso's affairs and the inability of previous governments to address the security crisis plaguing the Sahel region. Born in a small village outside Ouagadougou, Traore understood poverty firsthand. His childhood was marked by struggles that most of these generals had never experienced. While they attended prestigious military academies, he worked his way up through the ranks, earning respect from common soldiers who saw him as one of their own. His education at military academies in Burkina Faso had been supplemented by extensive reading about African history and Pan-Africanism. He studied the works of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader from the 1980s, and drew inspiration from leaders like Patrice Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah. This ideological foundation shaped his worldview and his approach to leadership. The security situation that brought Traore to power was complex and dangerous. Burkina Faso faced attacks from various armed groups linked to international terrorist organizations. These groups had killed thousands of civilians and displaced over 1 million people. The French military presence, supposedly there to help, had failed to bring stability after nearly a decade of operations. Traore's criticism of French involvement resonated with many Burkinabe who felt their country had been treated as a neo-colonial subject rather than a sovereign nation. His calls for African solutions to African problems struck a chord with young people across the continent who were tired of foreign interventions that seemed to benefit outsiders more than Africans. The generals arriving for this meeting represented a different philosophy. They believed in working within existing international frameworks and maintaining relationships with former colonial powers. To them, Traore's approach was dangerous and potentially destabilizing for the entire region. General Asante had been particularly vocal about his concerns. In private conversations with other African leaders, he had described Traore as a reckless young man who doesn't understand the complexities of international relations. He worried that Burkina Faso's changing foreign policy could trigger a domino effect across West Africa. The Nigerian general, Bashir, shared similar concerns but from a different angle. Nigeria's economy depended heavily on international partnerships and foreign investment. He feared that radical rhetoric about African independence could damage relationships that took decades to build. His country couldn't afford to alienate international partners. General Mwangi approached the situation from a strategic perspective. She believed that African unity was important, but it had to be achieved gradually through diplomatic channels rather than revolutionary rhetoric. Her experience in peacekeeping had taught her the importance of stability and measured progress. The Egyptian general brought a North African perspective that differed from his sub-Saharan counterparts. Egypt's strategic location and historical ties to both Africa and the Middle East gave him a unique viewpoint on international relations. He understood the importance of balancing various interests. General Ndaba's concerns were rooted in his experience with regime change. He had seen how quickly political situations could deteriorate when leaders moved too fast or pushed too hard against established systems. His years in South Africa had taught him about the complexities of transformation. As the generals gathered in the conference room, each carried their own agenda and expectations. They had come to deliver what they considered necessary guidance to a young leader who was making decisions that could affect the entire continent. They expected respect for their experience and compliance with their advice. But Ibrahim Traore had his own plans for this meeting. He understood exactly why these men had come to his country and what they hoped to accomplish. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal fundamental differences in vision for Africa's future. The atmosphere in the conference room grew heavy as the 5 generals took their seats around the polished table. Ibrahim Traore entered precisely at the scheduled time, his confident stride and steady gaze immediately commanding attention. Unlike the elaborate uniforms worn by his visitors, Traore's simple military attire reflected his connection to common soldiers. General Asante, as the senior member of the delegation, cleared his throat to begin what he expected would be a straightforward conversation. His years of diplomatic experience had taught him to approach such meetings with authority tempered by respect. He believed that age and experience should guide youth and enthusiasm. "President Traore," Asante began, his voice carrying the weight of decades in uniform. "We have come here today as your brothers and elders in service to our continent. We are concerned about the direction your administration has taken and the potential consequences for regional stability." The other generals nodded in agreement, their faces showing the serious nature of their mission. They had prepared carefully for this moment, discussing strategy during their flight to Ouagadougou. Each had specific points to raise, and they expected their combined presence to demonstrate the gravity of the situation. Traore listened quietly, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. He had anticipated this moment from the day he took power. These men represented everything he believed was wrong with African leadership: the willingness to bow to external pressure and accept limitations imposed by former colonial powers. General Bashir leaned forward, his voice firm and direct. "Your statements against French involvement in the Sahel are causing ripple effects across the region. Nigeria has worked for years to build strategic partnerships that benefit our people. Your rhetoric threatens to undermine relationships that provide security and economic benefits." The Nigerian general's concerns were not without merit from his perspective. His country had received significant military aid and training from international partners. Trade relationships with former colonial powers still provided substantial revenue. He genuinely believed that confrontational approaches would harm African interests. General Mwangi added her perspective with the measured tone of someone accustomed to navigating complex political situations. "President Traore, We understand your desire for African independence, but progress must be gradual and strategic. Sudden changes in foreign policy can create chaos that ordinary citizens will suffer from most. Her words carried particular weight because of her reputation for careful analysis and successful peacekeeping operations. She had seen firsthand how political instability affected civilian populations, especially women and children who had limited means to protect themselves from violence. The Egyptian general, Rahman, brought a broader regional perspective to the discussion. The security challenges facing the Sahel require international cooperation. Egypt has successfully balanced independence with strategic partnerships. We maintain our sovereignty while benefiting from mutually advantageous relationships. His approach reflected Egypt's historical position as a bridge between Africa, the Middle East, and the broader international community. He believed in pragmatic diplomacy that achieved national goals without unnecessary confrontation. General Ndaba, drawing from his experience in South Africa's transformation, spoke with the gravity of someone who had witnessed both successful and failed transitions. Young man, I have seen what happens when leaders move too quickly against established systems. The consequences can be devastating for generations. Throughout these presentations, Traore remained silent, occasionally taking notes but never interrupting. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the intensity of the general's concerns. They interpreted his silence as either respect for their experience or perhaps nervousness about the weight of their collective disapproval. The real ultimatum came when General Asante resumed speaking, his tone becoming more direct and authoritative. President Traore, we are here to offer you guidance but also to deliver a clear message from the African military establishment. Your current path is unsustainable and dangerous. He paused for effect, ensuring that every word carried maximum impact. We strongly recommend that you moderate your rhetoric regarding international partnerships. The French military presence in the region serves important security functions that your national forces cannot yet handle independently. The ultimatum became more specific as each general added their demands. They wanted Traore to publicly acknowledge the value of international partnerships, particularly with France. They expected him to tone down his Pan-African rhetoric and focus on gradual, incremental change rather than revolutionary transformation. General Bashir was particularly explicit about expectations. Your statements about African unity are admirable, in principle, but they must not come at the expense of practical relationships that provide security and economic benefits. Nigeria expects Burkina Faso to maintain responsible regional leadership. The generals also expressed concerns about Traore's domestic policies, particularly his efforts to reduce French economic influence in Burkina Faso. They argued that such moves could destabilize the regional economy and harm ordinary citizens, who depended on established trade relationships. General Mwangi emphasized the importance of maintaining stability during any transition period. Change must be managed carefully, with consideration for all stakeholders. Revolutionary rhetoric may excite young people, but it often leads to chaos that hurts the most vulnerable populations. The pressure in the room intensified as the generals made clear that this was not merely advice, but an expectation backed by their collective influence. They represented military establishments that controlled significant resources and had extensive international connections. Their disapproval could have serious consequences for Burkina Faso's regional relationships. General Rahman added a subtle but unmistakable threat to their message. African leaders must work together responsibly. Those who choose confrontational approaches often find themselves isolated and unable to effectively serve their people's interests. The implication was clear: comply with their guidance or face potential isolation from other African governments. They believed their combined pressure would convince the young leader to adopt a more moderate approach that aligned with their vision of responsible governance. As the ultimatum reached its conclusion, General Ndaba delivered what they considered the final word. President Traore, we respect your passion for African development, but leadership requires wisdom and restraint. We hope you will consider our counsel carefully and adjust your approach accordingly. The general sat back, confident that they had presented a compelling case supported by their collective experience and authority. They expected Traore to request time to consider their recommendations, or perhaps to negotiate some middle ground that addressed their concerns. But something in Traore's expression had changed during their presentations. The quiet young man who had listened respectfully was now looking at each general with the intensity that suggested their ultimatum had awakened something they had not anticipated. The stage was set for a response that would shock everyone in the room. The transformation in Ibrahim Traore was remarkable to witness. The quiet, respectful young leader who had listened patiently to their ultimatum was gone, replaced by someone whose presence filled the room with an almost electric energy. His eyes blazed with conviction as he prepared to deliver the response that would define this historic confrontation. "Gentlemen," Traore began, his voice now carrying the full weight of moral authority, "you have given me an ultimatum based on fear. Fear that a young African leader might actually believe in the independence we claimed to have achieved decades ago. Fear that someone might refuse to accept limitations imposed by those who have never lived in the villages you claim to protect." He walked around the table slowly, his movement deliberate and commanding. Each step seemed to increase the pressure in the room as the generals realized they were no longer controlling this conversation. "But let me give you some facts that your international partnership seemed to have overlooked," Traore continued, his voice gaining momentum like thunder rolling across the horizon. "Since 2013, when the French military intervention began in Mali and expanded across the Sahel, terrorist attacks have increased by over 300%. Displacement has reached unprecedented levels. Economic development has stagnated." General Bashir attempted to interrupt, but Traore's raised hand and piercing gaze silenced him before he could speak. "These are not opinions, General. These are documented facts that your strategic partnerships have somehow failed to address. So when you come to my country and demand that I continue policies that have demonstrably failed, you are essentially asking me to betray the trust of the Burkinabe people who brought me to power to change these very policies." The young president's voice took on a quality that resonated with moral certainty. "You speak of responsibility and wisdom. But where was the responsibility when international military contractors extracted billions of dollars in payments while African children continued to die? Where was the wisdom in maintaining arrangements that enriched foreign companies while African nations remained trapped in cycles of dependency?" He stopped directly in front of General Asante, the senior member of their delegation. "General, you have served with distinction for over 30 years. In all that time, have you ever seen a foreign military intervention in Africa that actually solved the problems it claimed to address? Have you seen any evidence that accepting limitations on African sovereignty leads to genuine development and security?" Asante struggled to find an answer that would maintain his position while acknowledging the uncomfortable truth in Traore's questions. The young leader's direct challenge had exposed the fundamental weakness in their argument. Traore continued his systematic dismantling of their ultimatum. "You demand that I moderate my rhetoric about African unity, but what exactly threatens you about Africans working together? What terrifies you about the possibility that African nations might coordinate their resources and policies to benefit African people?" He turned to face General Mwangi. "You speak about protecting vulnerable populations, but can you explain how accepting foreign military bases that fail to prevent attacks actually protects anyone? Can you tell me how allowing foreign corporations to extract resources at predetermined prices helps African families escape poverty?" The Kenyan general found herself confronted with questions that challenged her entire framework for understanding international relations and development. Her carefully constructed diplomatic approach seemed inadequate in the face of such direct moral challenges. "The truth," Traore declared, his voice rising to fill the entire room, "is that your ultimatum is not about protecting African interest. It is about protecting systems that have failed Africans for generations. It is about maintaining arrangements that benefit everyone except the people we were elected to serve." He returned to his position at the head of the table, but now his presence seemed to dominate the space completely. "You came here expecting to intimidate a young leader with your collective authority and international connections. You expected me to bow to pressure and accept limitations on Burkina Faso's sovereignty. But you made a fundamental miscalculation. The general sat in stunned silence as Traore prepared to deliver the core of his response. You assumed that I would value your approval more than the trust of my people. You assumed that fear of isolation would override my commitment to genuine independence. You assumed that a young African leader would automatically defer to the accumulated compromises of previous generations. His voice dropped to a more personal level, but somehow became even more powerful. But gentlemen, I did not take power to manage decline gracefully. I did not accept responsibility for this nation's future so that I could continue policies that have demonstrably failed. I came to power because the Burkinabe people demanded change, not cosmetic adjustments. 2. Failing systems. General Rahman attempted to regain some ground. President Traore, your idealism is admirable, but governance requires practical compromises. No nation can survive in complete isolation from international systems. Traore's response came like a sword thrust. General Rahman, with respect, you are creating a false choice. Rejecting dependency is not the same as choosing isolation. Demanding equality in international relationships is not the same as refusing cooperation. The problem with your approach is that you have accepted inequality as the natural order and are now asking me to do the same. He leaned forward, his intensity making every word count. When Egypt built the Aswan High Dam, did you ask permission from former colonial powers? When you nationalized the Suez Canal, did you accept limitations imposed by those who previously controlled it? So why do you expect Burkina Faso to accept arrangements that Egypt itself would never tolerate? The Egyptian general realized he had been trapped by his own nation's history of assertive independence, which directly contradicted the accommodating approach he was advocating for Burkina Faso. The fundamental issue, Traore continued, building toward his ultimate point, is that you have forgotten what independence actually means. You have become so accustomed to managed sovereignty that you mistake it for the real thing. You have accepted limitations for so long that you now see them as natural and unchangeable. His voice took on a prophetic quality as he prepared to deliver the climax of his response. But I represent a generation that has seen through these illusions. We have studied the history you lived through, and we have reached different conclusions about its meaning. We refuse to accept that African nations must choose between security and sovereignty, between development and independence. The room fell silent as Traore gathered himself for the final phase of his response, the moment that would either end his political career or establish him as a leader who would reshape continental politics. The generals sat transfixed, realizing they had awakened something far more powerful than they had anticipated. The climax of Ibrahim Traore's response began with a moment of profound silence as he gathered his thoughts for what would become the most defining speech of his presidency. The 5 generals sat transfixed, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something far beyond a typical diplomatic exchange. This young leader was about to articulate a vision that would challenge the very foundations of post-colonial African politics. "Gentlemen," Traore began, his voice now carrying the weight of historical moment, "you have asked me to choose between the approval of established power structures and the aspirations of African people. You have presented this as a choice between responsible leadership and dangerous radicalism, but you have missed the real choice facing our generation." He moved to stand directly in the center of the room, equidistant from all 5 generals, his presence somehow making the space feel both larger and more intimate simultaneously. The real choice is between accepting permanent inferiority or demanding equality. The real choice is between managing decline or creating genuine development. The real choice is between serving systems that exploit Africa or building systems that serve Africans. His voice began to build with controlled passion. For over 60 years, African leaders have been told that we must be realistic about our limitations. We have been instructed to accept whatever relationships are offered to us by those who previously colonized our lands. We have been convinced that African solutions are inherently inferior to foreign interventions. General Ndaba attempted one. Final interruption. "President Traore, we are not asking you to accept inferiority. We are simply suggesting that international cooperation." Traore's response cut through the attempted justification like lightning. "General Ndaba, what you call international cooperation, I call conditional assistance designed to maintain dependency. When partners refuse to share technology, limit African participation in decision-making, and extract more value than they provide, that is not cooperation. That is exploitation with diplomatic language. The South African general fell silent, recognizing that his own experience with international sanctions during apartheid contradicted his current advocacy for accommodation with international pressure. But today, Traore continued, his voice rising with conviction, I speak for a generation that rejects these false limitations. I speak for young Africans who refuse to accept that our continent, blessed with more natural resources than any other, should remain dependent on others for basic security and development. He pointed toward the window overlooking Ouagadougou. Out there, in the streets of our capital, young people are working, studying, and building businesses despite having access to only a fraction of the resources available to their counterparts. In countries that lecture us about responsibility and realism, they represent the true potential of Africa. When we stop accepting artificial limitations, the energy in the room shifted as Traore's words began to paint a vision that none of the generals had expected. They had come to deliver warnings about dangers, but instead found themselves confronted with possibilities they had not considered. You warn me about the consequences of rejecting international partnerships, Traore continued, his voice gaining prophetic power. But what about the consequences of continuing to accept partnerships that have failed for decades? What about the consequence of telling another generation of African children that they must wait for foreigners to solve African problems? His gaze swept across each general in turn, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths. General Asante, you have seen 63 years of Ghanaian independence. Can you honestly tell me that accepting limitations has brought Ghana the development it deserves? General Bashir, after decades of international partnership, can you tell me that Nigeria's security challenges have been solved by foreign assistance? Neither general could provide a satisfactory answer, and their silence spoke volumes about the effectiveness of the approaches they were defending. The tragedy, Traore declared, his voice now carrying the full weight of moral authority, is that you have become prisoners of your own compromises. You have accepted limitations for so long that you now see them as natural laws rather than political choices. You have forgotten that sovereignty is not something others grant us. It is something we claim and defend. He returned to his seat, but his commanding presence remained undiminished. So let me be absolutely clear about Burkina Faso's response to your ultimatum. We will not moderate our commitment to African independence. We will not accept limitations on our sovereignty imposed by those who benefit from African dependency. The generals exchanged glances of disbelief and growing concern. This was not the compliance or negotiation they had expected, but rather a complete rejection of their authority and assumptions. We will not apologize for believing that African problems require African solutions, Traore continued with unwavering determination. We will not moderate our rhetoric about African unity because some find it threatening to established power structures. We will not pretend that failed policies deserve continued support simply because they have international backing. His voice took on a quality of absolute certainty. Instead, we will work with any African nation that shares our commitment to genuine independence and equal partnership. We will build relationships based on mutual benefit rather than conditional assistance. We will demonstrate that African nations can provide security for their own people without accepting permanent subordination to foreign powers. The room had become electrified with tension as the full implications of Traore's response became clear. He was not only rejecting their ultimatum, but issuing a counter-challenge to everything they represented. You came here today believing that your collective pressure would force a young leader to abandon his principles, Traore said, his voice now carrying an edge of steel. You assumed that fear of isolation would overcome commitment to independence. You calculated that threats would prove more powerful than truth. He stood once more, his final words building toward a crescendo that would forever change the dynamics of African leadership. But you made one fundamental error in your calculations. You forgot that some principles are worth more than approval, and some causes are worth more than comfort. The final moments of Ibrahim Traore's response would be remembered as a turning point in African leadership. The young president stood at the center of the room, his presence commanding absolute attention as he prepared to deliver words that would echo across the continent for generations to come. "You want to know what destroys your ultimatum completely?" Traore asked, his voice now carrying the quiet confidence of someone who held ultimate moral authority in the conversation. "It is destroyed by the simple fact that everything you fear is already happening." He gestured toward the window with sweeping authority. "Across Africa, young people are rejecting the limitations you want me to accept. In universities from Dakar to Nairobi, students are studying African history and reaching the same conclusions I have reached. In boardrooms from Lagos to Johannesburg, entrepreneurs are building businesses that serve African markets with African solutions." His words began to paint a picture of continental transformation that none of the generals had fully grasped. "Your ultimatum assumes that I am alone in this vision, that Burkina Faso stands isolated in its commitment to genuine independence. But you are wrong. We represent a movement that is sweeping across Africa, carried by young people who refuse to accept the compromises of previous generations." General Asante made one final attempt to reassert authority. "President Traore, regardless of changing sentiments, you still need international support to address security challenges and economic development. Idealism cannot replace practical resources." Traore's response came with devastating precision. "General Asante, your definition of practical resources has left Africa importing food despite having the best agricultural land in the world. Your practical approach has left us importing manufactured goods despite having abundant raw materials. Your practical international support has left us less secure after 9 years of intervention than we were before it began." The Ghanaian general realized that his appeal to practicality had been turned against him by someone who understood the contradictions in their position better than they did. "The ultimate irony," Traore continued, building toward his conclusion, "is that you came here to warn me about isolation. But you represent the most isolated perspective on the continent. You represent leaders who are disconnected from the aspirations of their own people, who have lost touch with the dreams that originally motivated African independence movements." His voice rose with passionate conviction. "I have traveled across Burkina Faso since taking power. I have sat with farmers." The silence that followed the general's ultimatum was profound and uncomfortable. For several moments, only the ticking of an antique clock on the wall marked the passage of time. The 5 senior military leaders sat with the satisfaction of men who believed they had delivered an irrefutable argument backed by decades of combined experience and continental influence. Ibrahim Traore slowly placed his pen on the table and looked up, meeting each general's gaze in turn. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried an underlying steel that none of them had expected from someone they considered an inexperienced young leader. "Honorable generals," Traore began, standing slowly and walking to the window that overlooked Ouagadougou's bustling streets. "I have listened to your concerns with the respect due to your ranks and years of service. But before I respond to your ultimatum, let me share something with you." The word ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge. The generals exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that this young man had understood exactly what they were doing and was not intimidated by their collective pressure. Traore gestured toward the window, his voice taking on a storytelling quality that immediately captured attention. 3 weeks ago, I visited a village about 200 kilometers north of here. The village had been attacked by armed groups 6 months earlier. 17 people died, including children and elderly residents who couldn't escape. He turned back to face the generals, his eyes burning with quiet intensity. "The survivors told me something interesting. They said French military patrols had passed through their area regularly for months before the attack. These patrols had sophisticated equipment, satellite communication, and intelligence networks. Yet somehow, they never detected the threat that local villagers had been whispering about for weeks." General Asante shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was not the response they had anticipated. They expected either compliance or at least negotiation, not a counter-narrative that challenged their assumptions. Traore continued his account with devastating precision. The village chief, an old man named Boubacar, asked me a simple question. He said, "President, if these foreign soldiers are here to protect us, why do we keep burying our children?" I had no good answer for him that day. The room's atmosphere had completely changed. Instead of defending himself against their ultimatum, Traore was building a case that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying their demands. "General Bashir," Traore said, addressing the Nigerian directly, "you spoke about maintaining relationships that provide security benefits. Can you explain to me how Burkina Faso's security situation improved during 9 years of French military presence? Because from where I stand, I see more displaced people, more attacks, and more instability than when the intervention began." Bashir opened his mouth to respond, but Traore continued without pause, his voice gaining momentum. "You mentioned Nigeria's strategic partnerships. I respect Nigeria's sovereignty to make its own choices. But can you honestly tell me that those partnerships have solved Nigeria's security challenges? Can you tell me that Boko Haram was defeated by international cooperation?" The Nigerian general's face darkened at the direct challenge, but he remained silent as Traore pressed on with relentless logic. "General Mwangi, you speak about gradual progress and working within existing systems. I have a question for you. How many more generations of African children should wait for this gradual progress? How many more decades should we accept systems designed to keep us dependent on others for our basic security?" The Kenyan general had built her reputation on measured diplomacy, but she found herself without a ready answer to such direct questioning. Traore's approach was unlike anything she had encountered in typical political negotiations. Traore moved closer to the table, his presence somehow seeming to fill the entire room despite his relatively young age. "General Rahman, you mentioned Egypt's success in balancing independence with partnerships. I respect Egypt's achievements, but let me ask you this. When was the last time Egypt allowed foreign military bases on its soil to conduct operations without Egyptian command and control?" The Egyptian general realized he was being cornered by his own logic. Egypt indeed maintained strict control over foreign military activities within its borders, something that contradicted the arrangement they were asking Traore to accept. And General Ndaba, Traore continued, his voice taking on an edge of moral authority, "you warned me about the dangers of moving too quickly against established systems. But respectfully, sir, weren't you part of a movement that completely dismantled an established system called apartheid? Did you accept gradual change when children were being shot in Soweto?" The South African general felt the weight of his own history being used against him. The comparison was uncomfortable because it forced him to confront the contradiction between his revolutionary past and his current conservative advice. Traore returned to his seat, but his commanding presence remained as he prepared to address the heart of their ultimatum. "Gentlemen, you came here today with an ultimatum based on the assumption that I am a reckless young man who doesn't understand international relations. You believe that your experience and connections give you the authority to dictate policy to a sovereign nation." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his most pointed observation. "But I wonder if your experience has blinded you to a fundamental truth about what is happening across our continent. Young Africans are tired of leaders who speak about independence while accepting dependence. They are tired of hearing about sovereignty while watching foreign powers make decisions about African lives." The generals were beginning to realize that they had seriously underestimated their opponent. This was not the diplomatic negotiation they had expected, but rather a fundamental challenge to their worldview and authority. "You speak of stability," Traore continued, his voice rising slightly. "But what stability are you referring to? The stability of systems that have left millions of Africans in poverty despite abundant natural resources? The stability of arrangements that benefit foreign corporations while African workers earn subsistence wages?" General Asante attempted to regain control of the conversation. "President Traore, these are complex issues that require careful consideration and international cooperation. No African nation can address these challenges alone." Traore's response came like a thunderclap. "General Asante, with all due respect, that is exactly the mindset that has kept us dependent for over 60 years since independence. When will we have enough international cooperation? When will we be ready to take responsibility for our own destiny? The young president stood again, and this time his movement had the quality of someone preparing for battle. The next phase of his response would shatter every expectation the generals had brought into the room.